Hi, everyone, and welcome to another live. Today, we're going to be talking about heart disease and genetics. This is based on a comment I got on one of the previous lives. So, thank you for your comments. I really do appreciate it. And someone was saying, look, it's just genetic, and he listed a specific disease, which is, thought to be more genetic than otherwise. But I got news, right? So, if you think that heart disease is in your genes and therefore inevitable, we have to re-examine that premise, right? Because science says otherwise, right? So genetics, even if you talk with very mainstream people who are more mainstream than me, I'm mainstream within the field of sort of decolonial anthropology, which is really my focus. But if you look at people who are mainstream in the health sphere, they will talk about genetics loading the gun and lifestyle pulling the trigger, or the environment pulling the trigger, right? So why would that be the case? First of all, only 10% of disease in general and heart disease in specific can be considered purely genetic. Maybe less than that, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt. 10%, okay? Very, very rare instances of people having certain genetic clotting factors, sickle cell disease, which I talked about before, other things, which just the genes are such a determinant that you're going to have heart disease, right? But that's less than 10%. I would say even 1%, right? The other 99% is really about epigenetics. Epigenetics, remember, so if we think of genes as think of it as like a folded, it's really a folded wire. If you look at these, we have these amazing videos now you can find online. Maybe I'll post it down below when I get the chance. Think of it as like a ball of string, your genes, right? And there's something which is telling that ball of string to unwind at a certain point, and then that is coding for certain proteins. This is why we have the same DNA in every one of our cells, but some cells become a red blood cell, some cells become a white blood cell, some cells become a brain cell, some cells become a heart cell. That's all epigenetics, right? There's certain things that are telling, certain parts of our DNA to unwind and code for proteins in certain places, and it's the same DNA, but other bits of it are being unwound and sort of being told to code for certain proteins in different places. So it's all epigenetics, right? Because otherwise we'd all be like a single cell. There wouldn't be anything there, right? And in certain environment, under certain forms of stress, we code for heart disease. We code for other disease, right? And that's regardless. Of course, if you don't have the genes, you're never going to get the disease. If you don't have the genes for a certain kind of myocarditis or whatever it is, you're never really going to get that, right? But even if you have the genes, you may never get it because maybe the genes never turn on, right? There are certain studies, the Interheart study comes to mind, there are a few others, where their estimates are, now I take all these with a huge grain of salt because I don't really trust a lot of the methodology here, but their estimates are that 90% of heart attacks are preventable with lifestyle changes, right? Now, what I will say is that the genetics often offer us an excuse, and that's quite dangerous. So we don't want to be excusing ourselves. We don't want to be we don't want to be ignoring lifestyle and saying, oh, it's just my genes, I can't do anything, right? So what I'd say is that even if you have very strong genetic predispositions, even if your parents, especially for men, it's usually the father had a heart attack young, but that does increase the risk. But the risk is not destiny, right? They're shared, the environments and habits that you learned growing up with your parents, those matter far more than the genetics, right? So if you learned, I don't know, if every Tuesday night as it was sometimes in my household growing up, maybe every Tuesday night was taco night. Wednesday nights we'd order a pizza. Friday night we'd have an ice cream party. If that's the habits that you're going to bring to adulthood, that matters a lot more than your DNA, right? And we know this. How do we know this? Because when we look at populations, for example, Japanese populations have been studied in great detail. When we look at Japanese populations living in Japan, and Japanese populations living in Japan have a pretty low risk of heart disease. It's gone up in recent years, but it's still relatively low for the industrialized world, right? But then you compare Japanese populations that come to the US, and they also start doing whatever it is, pizza on Fridays and tacos on Tuesday and all the rest of it. Their risk basically looks the same as the US population as a whole, right? And this is a study that's been done with many different populations, Hawaiian populations in Hawaii eating traditional diets, very low risk of disease. As they move to mainstream US and they adopt more US style eating patterns, their risk goes up, et cetera, right? So what we can say is that the genes might predispose you to inflammation or whatever it may be. Clotting is what we're really concerned about when we're talking about heart disease. Even your genes may predispose you to like very serious diseases like enlargement of the heart and so on, but they don't cause that. Well, again, 99 times out of 100, that's not the cause. The cause is something else. The cause are the environmental triggers, the sets of triggers, right? What are some of those triggers? We've talked about insulin resistance or so-called insulin resistance. For me, it's really hyperinsulinemia, high insulin levels that are chronically high. Again, that's from eating diets that are too high in sugar and refined seed oils, et cetera, and carbohydrates in general. Some people think they're eating, brown bread and so on. It's a healthy carbohydrate. Nonsense. You have exactly the same insulin spike. Or you can test that. Buy a finger pricking thing from the store. It's not super expensive. In the US, I think we're talking about $40 or so. Here in South Africa, I think you can get it for less than 400 rand, somewhere around there. Just test how, have a slice of white bread, prick your finger, see what the blood sugar is. Have a slice of whole wheat, brown bread, organic, sourdough, whatever. Prick your finger, see what the difference is. It may be a little bit different, but it's still going to be super high, right? So high insulin levels is one thing. Oxidative stress is another thing. If you live in a polluted environment, if you smoke cigarettes, etc., if you consume a lot of oxidated seed oils, that's going to be another thing that's predisposing you to this heart disease. And the third thing is really chronic inflammation. So again, we talk about stress, we talk about gut inflammation. Stress is a big thing, but also the diet is causing the stress. And also, if you haven't discovered a fasting window that works for you, often it doesn't matter what you eat, but you're just eating too often and you're stressing yourself too often, right? So if we consider this sort of visually, those blood sugar spikes and troughs, which a lot of us are stuck into, if you ever feel like you get low energy late in the day and then you have to eat something, that's a sign that you're really suffering from these high insulin levels, from blood sugar spikes that are totally wrecking all aspects of your health, but especially your heart health, right? Now, once we keep in mind, so we may have a genetic predisposition. In my case, I have an uncle who died prematurely of heart disease. I've talked about that before. Maybe other people have other genetic risk factors and so on, but you can actually silence those bad genes, right? You can take dietary steps to improve that, right? So you can talk about increasing your intake of omega-3 PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids. For me, it's also just about whole foods, right? Forget about don't overcomplicate things. Have meat and fish, and if you want some vegetables, but meat and fish and eggs are really the main things that we should be focusing on. And you're going to improve your heart outcomes 100% of the time, or you're going to drastically improve them. Let's put it that way. Movement, if you can move in more ancestral ways. So what I don't like is people who are focusing on really long distance running and so on. Not that there's anything wrong with that. If you're into it, great. But if you're trying to get more movement into your life, maybe try small steps that are not too strenuous and that focus also on recovery, right? We don't want to be exercising all the time. We want recovery days, right? But there are studies that show that just walking 30 minutes a day can cut risk by, depends on the study, 20 to 40% and so on. Again, I don't put too much scope in those studies because, the methodology isn't great, right? And often there's not good controls, et cetera, et cetera. But every study seems to show that exercise improves outcomes. So some form of exercise is a great idea. If you improve your sleep, that's another great step. There are other studies which show that if we don't sleep well, your chances of going on to have a heart attack are like huge, right? So even if you can do one thing, if you're not sleeping well, that's like low-hanging fruit. Try and maximize the time that you're spending in bed, or at least spend 8 hours in the bed every night. Try and sleep at regular times. Try and get early morning sunlight. Maybe if you want to support with some magnesium and so on in the early stages, you can. These things are sort of low-hanging fruit for improving sleep, right? So when you think about this, and getting back to the epigenetics or the genetics as well, so people talk about the ApoE4 gene as being linked to a heart disease, which it seems to be, right, at an associational level. But we also have a gene called 9p21, which responds to antioxidants in the diet, or its response to dietary antioxidants and so on. So you have control, right? You have control over which of those genes do you want to turn on? Do you want to turn on your ApoE4 or do you want to turn on your 9p21? Um, so that's some ideas. If you can just take one thing away from this discussion, just understand that genes are not your destiny. The best medication for our heart, and by extension, the whole body. By the way, why I focus on the heart for me is because it's such. I think it's the most important organ in the body, right? It's such a determinant. When we talk about love, we talk about the heart. When we talk about being openness, we talk about the heart being open, and so on. So for me, the heart is really the center of the human body, and the best thing for the heart is not a pill, right? From 99% of people, it has nothing to do with medication. It has to do with how you eat, how you move, how you live. And if you want a detailed plan, there's a free webinar at samirdasani.net/webinar. You can check that out. You can go deeper. There's also a link there to join the Healthy Heart Blueprint course, which will be beginning very, very soon. So check it out. Thanks so much, and I will see you in the next one.